Prismo shareholders, thank you for joining us here. A new Prismo in the news. We had a news release this morning announcing that we have identified two different mineralized veins at our Silver King project in Arizona, which is, to remind our listeners, just outside the town of Superior, which is 55-minute drive east of Phoenix International Airport, just next to Resolution Copper, which is a joint venture between BHP and Rio Tinto. And that discovery, this identification of those veins came as a result of a good month plus of exploration work from our Chief Exploration Officer, Dr. Craig Gibson. And before we talk about the significance of those veins, Craig, maybe you want to update our shareholders on what the program exploration work consists of generally, and then we'll get into the more specifics of the significance of these two veins, and then what some of the next steps will be. So, what were the objectives going into Silver King several weeks ago?
Yeah, thanks, Alain. Well, as you know, there's really not a whole lot of data on the deposit at Silver King. We have a general map from the USGS that has geologic formations on it and some descriptive data on the mineralization, but we really, don't have a good feeling, or we didn't have a good feeling for what it was. And so the goal for this first period was basically to do some recon work around the Silver King deposit itself. I personally have been visiting all the small mines and prospects on the property and adjacent to it. And then we have a crew doing basically a soil survey grid or soil sample grid around the surface expression of the deposit. And the idea there is try to understand the geology, what's controlling the mineralization, which we can't really see because it's all underground. So we're doing everything we can at the surface to get a handle on how the deposit formed.
So when we acquired the rights to Silver King, and we started talking to investors, well, it was investors like what they saw. Our stocks doubled in the last couple months. We've raised over $1 million. But one thing that we would hear from investors was, what is the exploration potential of the property, and could it be that the production of silver back in the late 1800s, early 1900s took everything that was there and there's nothing left behind, which was not our expectation. Obviously, we wouldn't have done the deal, but it was a fair question. And so, what's the significance of these finds that constitute the bulk of the news in our press release today?
Well, you're right, Elaine. Somebody could easily say, well, it's been mined out and you just got a husk of a mine. But we know that the owners that were there reopened the shaft in the late 90s, and they produced a small tonnage of high grade ore. And their descriptions of it lead us to believe that some of the older descriptions from the 20s and 30s, that a significant portion of the upper part of the deposit still remains in place. So we think that is true. But you're right, we don't know that until we get that data done. So I think it's significant that we found a couple of other occurrences that run across the property. And one of them in particular was, it's a very large mine dump, which we didn't really know anything about. It's not really been described before, don't even have a name for it. And I went to look at it, and there's a collapsed working there, but what I was surprised to see was in the face of this working was some small veins, veinlets over maybe 1.5 meters width. And I took a sample of that, broke it open, mineralization, sulfide mineralization, very similar to what we think the Silver King was based on dump samples at Silver King. So I was pretty interested in that and looked around and found a small stockpile of that mineralization. So there's a bit of it to look at. And we also saw that the old timers were producing that and actually smelting it right on site. So there's some residues of the smelting process there. So I think it's a significant vein there. The dump again, a significant size, so there was a fair amount of production and underground workings there. And I started following this vein, which was a small occurrences, and I followed it, for about 300-400 meters along strike and towards the Silver King mine, and it's going right towards the edge of the old glory hole, which they call it. So we think this is a similar mineralization and a standalone exploration target for us for the future.
And then we were talking internally. So obviously now it's been added to targets for drilling at some point. But let's talk about drilling. So the plan remains to start with drilling around the old silver mine, the old Silver King mine. I When you and Gordon were in the area and a few weeks back, sat down with Forest Services. So where's the process at, and can you explain a little bit? When people hear drilling permit, they can think it might take 60 days, 90 days, or 6 months or 9 months. This is a particular set of circumstances because it's an old mine. So to maybe explain what the process is and what the expectations are. I think it's a fairly straight line process, but if you could say more about that for our shareholders.
Well, the process there is a little bit different from our Hot Breccia project. Remember, we just filed a notice of intent, and that was what the BLM, which is the other federal entity that controls surface access and surface controls the surface rights. Uh, that's all they wanted. And the Forest Service, we filed a notice of intent, and they said, well, we want a little bit more than that. It's an active mining region, an old mine, so they wanted what is called a plan of operations, which is not a very detailed report, a little bit more detailed than a notice of intent, a little bit more on with the process of drilling and how you're going to control fluids and things like that. So we filed that, we prepared that, filed it. We submitted a application or a plan of operations that have 15 drill sites, all of them in the previously disturbed area around the Silver King mine. Our first pass idea was to drill, 5 or 6 of those for about 1,000 meters. And again, to test the upper portions of the vein and adjacent to the old working. So the idea there is to see what we have left and see what might be around the very high grade that was mined in the past. So we think, best case scenario, we could have that permit in a month or 2 months. We'll see how it goes, but we don't envision many problems because of the type of operation we're doing here.
That's right. And I've been copied on some emails, and there's certainly a good open dialogue with the authorities. So I'll move over to you, Gordon. You came on board not too long ago, and one of the first things that you did was to go to Arizona and visit Silver King and Ripsey and Hot Breccia. So any thoughts on what you saw during your visit with Craig?
Yeah, certainly, Alain. I think probably the thing that struck me the most was the size of these operations in terms of the copper production within that copper porphyry belt. It's actually uh, it's unbelievable actually how big some of the mines are there. The Ray and the Christmas we went by. We also went by the Miami area. Spent some time in Globe while we were meeting with the Forest Service there. And these are obviously world class mines. This porphyry copper belt is obviously a highly mineralized trend, and as it turns out, 3 of our projects now reside within that. As far as Silver King and Ripsey, it's always fascinating to see these historical mining operations or works, I guess. But I think there's meat left on the bone in both of those, and I think that there's another aspect of potential other mineralized elements that maybe have been looked at historically. So I think there's a number of ways to create value from these projects that we've taken on.
Well, thank you. And actually, that leads to my last question for Craig and about other minerals. And so the project's called Silver King. It was a silver mine. We found evidence of mineralization, but let's not discount the copper, because we're in copper country, as you just said, Gord. So I just want to read to you a couple sentence, Craig, from today's press release, and maybe have you say a few words on that. I think it's significant. There's still a lot of work that remains to be done, but it's a good reminder to shareholders about the location of the Silver King project. And the two sentences are as follows: the Silver King deposit is located a few kilometers from the Resolution copper deposit, which is a joint venture between Rio Tinto and BHP, and the high-grade Magma mine, a former copper and silver producer. Mineralization at Silver King is hosted by the same rock sequence that hosts the Resolution copper deposit, but which is exposed at the surface and not covered by the thick sequence of volcanic rocks that covers Resolution copper. So I mean, tell us a little bit about what you saw in terms of copper, and what do you expect?
Well, this is really exciting to work on this because everybody's been focusing on the silver potential, which is good. It's rightly so. But this area, as Gord mentioned, it's part of a major porphyry copper belt, and we're obviously part of the mineralization system that surrounds Resolution. Whether it's part of Resolution or a separate system, we'll find out. But the Magma mine was a very high grade copper, silver, polymetallic producer, which was also basically related to the Resolution deposit. And we're just sitting around the corner from Magma in the same rocks. We have mineralization, which I've looked at around the silver mineralization, which is very similar copper, rich mineralization. So we have a lot of things similar to Magma mine and similar to things you would expect around a porphyry copper deposit, including the intrusion that hosts the silver deposit. So, this thing really has not been explored for copper in the past because it was held by several different entities and private owners. So the majors have not held all the ground before, so they have not explored it. But looking at this, I think there's a pretty good exploration target for a copper play in the area. And our near-term goal is to look at the silver, try to see what's there for the silver potential. But there's pretty good potential for a copper deposit there, and I think we'll be talking more about that as we get more sample results, assay results in coming up. But I think that's it's a very exciting opportunity, and I think everybody's going to be pleased with that one.
Yes, and in conclusion, just remind our shareholders that which I like to use the analogy of the donut, right? So the donut is Resolution copper, that joint venture between Rio Tinto and BHP, and we're kind of the hole in the donut. We're surrounded by them. They self-describe their deposit as the largest unmined copper deposit out there. So, and there should be coming on stream here with the final approval sometime this year. So there'll be a lot of activity in the area, and so we're certainly excited, as you say, to pursue and this opportunity to learn more about copper potential on the property. So with that, our last word is, so we have samples in the lab. We're going to get results. We're going to be sharing that with our shareholders. We've applied for the drill permit. We expect to get news soon, and we'll be sharing that. And I will talk about more about the copper as the year unfolds. So thank you very much for everybody's support and taking the time to listen to Prismo in the news and learn more about today's press release. Thank you.